Good morning, and kia ora. Today I'm talking about Drupal's next decade, but first I wanted to just dig briefly into some of the issues that are most interesting. But first I want to say hello. Kia ora koutou, haere mai. He kaiwa hanga tukotoko me kaiwa kai whakatauira hau mai te tau 2001. I've been a web developer and designer since 2001. And this is my third time in New Zealand. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to really make this about New Zealand. I know that a lot of the people here are from elsewhere in Australia and New Zealand as well, but for this I wanted to bring things a little bit closer to home. And so if you want to use the hashtag Drupal's next decade, please feel free. And I also have several Maori sayings actually interspersed throughout. And please forgive me for my atrocious pronunciation of this. I represent a team at Acquia called Acquia Labs. Acquia Labs is a team of innovators. What we do is we build projects that really push the envelope and look at innovative ideas that take us into new directions when it comes to our interests in the cutting edge. So what are we going to talk about today? I want to talk about three different questions. The first is, where are we now? Ke hea tātou ina ane. Second, I want to talk about what is it that we need. He hea tātou e hia hia ana. And then third and finally, I want to talk about how do we actually get there? How is it that we can get to the point that I'm talking about with this next decade? Nā hea me haere tātou ki reira. In these three sections, I want to talk about first a history of the content that we see in Drupal. What does Drupal's content look like? What exactly does content mean in the Drupal context? I also want to talk about the widening gap between developer and marketer. This is something that is seen much more these days, and I want to talk briefly about that. I want to talk about some of the issues that face editors today in our environment, in our landscape of Drupal. I want to talk about several ways in which we can address some of these issues. And finally, showcase a few of these examples, some interesting ideas and some interesting projects that have come about in the last year. And finally, I'll talk very briefly about how we can actually build and map out a path towards this existence and this exciting future for Drupal. But first, there's a very important saying in Maori, which goes something like, "Inai ke te mohio koe, ko ai koe, I anga moi koe hea, ke te mohio koe, ke te anga atu ki hea." What that means is, if you know who you are, and if you know where you are from, then you know where you are going. So the first thing I want to do is I want to track a little bit of what the history of Drupal has been when it comes to content and experiences of content. In 2000, Dries Buytaert, who is the founder of the Drupal project and, of course, its current lead, started drop.org. And drop.org was an example of a website. And websites are these really interesting pieces of content and really interesting gatekeepers of content. But they have a very particular approach to how they think about text and images and multimedia. One example of this is that if you look at all the websites in the 2000s, they have large swaths of narrative text. They have a lot of images that might be interspersed throughout. And things like videos might be synonymous with these images. But you interact with this kind of interface through a keyboard and mouse. And as we track Drupal's history through the years, in 2001, for example, we see that Drupal 1.0 was released, Drupal 3.0 was released, and you see the growing maturity of Drupal. In 2002, for example, you see themes beginning to develop and much more of a design focus in the way that Drupal handles its user interface. In 2008, Drupal 6 was released. How many people are still on Drupal 6, by the way? Oh, we'll talk afterwards. But one thing that happened in 2012, over the course of these last, I would say, 10 years, is something really striking, which is that mobile and responsive became a very big issue, became a very big thing. And in 2012, Drupal addressed this headfirst with what's known as the Spark distribution. And the Spark distribution was really interesting because it was the first attempt to think about what it would be like for editors and for developers to work with Drupal in a way that made sense for responsive sites and for mobile. As you can see on the right side here, there's mobile-first editing, which is an example of how you can actually edit these kinds of interfaces and edit this kind of content on a mobile device. But if you think about responsive design, you think about mobile, and you think about your smartphone that you're using right now, one of the biggest problems is that it's not the same as a website. The content that we experience and the content that we are using and actually looking at on our devices is completely different. What we see is that large swaths of text will span the viewport. You're not going to be able to have a very kind of limited approach to how you think about that content. Images will span the viewport. Multimedia will also span the viewport. And interactions will happen via gestures. I want to come back to this screenshot later, and I'll talk more about what that actually means for this. One other thing that happened in 2012 is that Kyle Browning, a community member of Drupal, created the Drupal iOS SDK, which is an example of how Drupal could integrate with mobile applications and serve content to native mobile applications on your smartphone, whether it's an Android device or an iPhone. And one of the things that we're starting to see is that all of these different channels are beginning to stack up. In 2015, for example, you have the release of the Apple Watch. And there's a very striking moment in 2015, 2016, when people are saying, well, why can't I browse the web on an Apple Watch? Why can't I have access to the same content that I'm used to when I go to a website and when I use my mobile device on an Apple Watch? But the problem with these wearable devices, the problem with an Apple Watch, is that the real estate is really limited. You have very little leeway when it comes to what you can actually do with it. And that means that things can't really coexist. You can't have text and images happening at the same time, occurring at the same time in an Apple Watch. Fast forward one more year, and we now have the first examples of digital signage appearing in Drupal. Drupal is now serving content to digital signage at the University of Iowa, for example. And this is a really revolutionary thing because we're now seeing that large screens and large experiences, these very vast, massive experiences of content, are a perfectly vital way to actually use content as well. We see that this need for legibility means also that limited coexistence. And you can actually draw a parallel between an Apple Watch and this digital signage when you think about the fact that they both have to be legible from the standpoint of limited real estate. Next, earlier this year, Lullabot, a popular Drupal agency that many of you have probably heard of, announced that they served videos to a Roku device, a Roku set-top box, which means that you can now see videos served by Drupal on your TV. And this is actually a very interesting thing because Roku has severe limitations when it comes to how it displays content and how you, as a developer, are able to control how that content is presented. You have to fit into that template. You have to fit into the limitations of what is available to a developer in Roku. Fast forward even more, and earlier this year, actually, Acquia worked on several impressive projects regarding augmented reality, serving content through augmented reality overlays to the point where you could actually see content superimposed on your smartphone over a real-world experience. One of the things that is interesting about augmented reality is that it introduces a whole lot of freedom. You now have the ability to insert videos and text and other multimedia into this experience. It doesn't necessarily matter what it is that you need because augmented reality is something that's situational, it's locational, it's physical. Finally, earlier this year, Acquia also released a project called Ask Georgia Gov, which is a project that Acquia Labs completed for the state of Georgia to allow for citizens of that state to be able to ask questions about things like how to register to vote, how to apply for a driver's license, or even who the current governor of Georgia is. And the really interesting thing about conversational interfaces is that the way that you experience content as a user is now completely overturned. In a conversational setting, you don't have access to text. You don't have access to those visual elements that you're familiar with, that you've been accustomed to for a long time. What that means is that we have to approach content in a totally different way. If we want to be able to serve content to a Roku application, if you want to serve content to an Apple Watch, if you want to serve content to an augmented reality overlay, or if we want to serve content to a conversational interface like an Amazon Echo, things become very tricky very fast. I want to show you very briefly a demo of this, because it's actually a very interesting approach. What we actually did with this project is that we took the website content that's already available right now on the Georgia website. We adjusted it to be a little bit more conversational, to fit in a little bit more with the way in which people expect conversations to work. But all of this is still wrapped up in Drupal. It's all actually coming directly from Drupal. So let me actually play very briefly here a video for you.
Alexa, start Georgia Go.
Welcome to Georgia Go. Feel free to ask the question.
How do I renew my driver's license?
Does this sound helpful? Getting and renew your driver's license.
Yes.
The Department of Driver Services helps you earn, renew, or replace learner's permits and licenses. To carry a full license for everyday, non-commercial vehicles, you must be at least 16 years old.
That content that you just heard is coming directly from a Drupal 7 website, that is georgia.gov. And what Georgia has done is they've wrapped up a lot of this content into a FAQ system, which means that all of these questions and responses that people popularly ask, that people oftentimes ask towards a government hotline, can be handled through an Amazon Echo. And that's just the beginning. I've got plenty of other things to show you here coming up as well. So the point that I'm trying to get at here is what's next? Drupal has always been considered to be something focused on the website, to be focused on web-driven experiences. But increasingly, we're seeing Drupal used in these really forward-looking, futuristic ways that really stretch the way that a CMS is conceived and conceptualized. And one of the things that I really have thought about is that we have to figure out a way to harness all of these things together. And so this saying, means we have to come together. We can't have separate things. We can't have separate approaches to the same problem. What does that actually mean? Well, let's take a look at how things differ when it comes to these experiences. I want all of us in this room to think very briefly about how you use Drupal today, or if you're new to Drupal, how you came to learn about Drupal. And I want us to think very carefully about what it is that we do on a daily basis. Do you edit content? Do you write code? Do you build layouts? Do you drag around blocks? What does that actually entail? Because one of the things that we've all known about Drupal for a very long time is that there's two very crucial elements, two very crucial dimensions that we all operate on. Number one, code, and also editing. We want to be able to allow for our clients, our customers, our enterprise clients to be able to use Drupal in a very easy way. So the value proposition of Drupal has always been that we want to simultaneously be able to harness the power of this CMS for editors, for marketers, for developers, for this wide swath of personas, each of which is very different from one another. We've always been proud of this notion of Drupal. I think since the very beginning of Drupal, there's been this notion that Drupal's great for users because we've built these experiences as developers, and we also enable people who don't actually know how to code to be able to build these experiences themselves as well. So we have these three competing personas, the developer, the marketer, and the user. But here's the question that I want to ask today. Is the CMS, and that encompasses a very large category of different pieces of software, different ideas of what software should be, is it fundamentally dead? Is it misguided? Is it in decline? Is it something that we have to reinvent and rethink? I'm going to argue yes today. And I know that many of you have thought about Drupal as solely a CMS, but I want to get away from that a little bit and think about Drupal as a means to providing very different experiences from the ones that we're building right now. Because the fundamental question that we have to answer over the next 10 years, especially as we enter years 21 through 30 of Drupal's history, we have to ask ourselves, how do we keep up with these experiences that we don't even know about yet, that won't exist for another 24 months, or 36 months, or 72 months? The ideal CMS has to think about this from an omnichannel perspective. What that means is that we have to be able to develop these experiences as coders and as programmers. We have to be able to build these things in a very diverse way, whether it's for augmented reality, whether it's for mobile applications, what have you. But at the same time, we have to enable those clients that we have, those customers that we have, who are paying us their hard-earned dollars, and tell them this is how you can actually edit content and work through your content using this approach. Because ultimately, the most important persona of all of this is the user. Editorial experience is a really crucial thing. Because oftentimes what developers want is actually in complete opposition to what marketers and our customers want. Because how do you edit digital signage? How do you edit things like augmented reality? How do you edit a conversational interface of content? Those are some of the questions I want to probe today. And what we're seeing increasingly over the course of the last couple of years especially is that this idea that Drupal is at the perfect spot, right in the middle between all of these different characters in this grand story of Drupal, might not actually be reconcilable. They might not actually be able to come around and get this same experience that they've had in the past, because Drupal fundamentally is now moving past websites in addition to its existing focus. What does this mean? Well, it means that we have what I call a new incongruity, which means that there's a big gap between what we want to do as developers and what our clients expect from us to provide them as their hired developers as well. So what I want to do is if you take one slide away from this presentation, this is the one that I want you to take, because fundamentally, we as developers, we can build any of these things. You know, if you want to learn about how to write an Amazon Echo skill, or if you want to learn about how to write an AR overlay, or if you want to learn about how to write a Roku application, those are all things that we can learn. But fundamentally, someone who's a marketer, someone who's an editor, someone who's able to write content but not write code is going to be limited to these things on the bottom. And so we have to think increasingly about how we as developers can enable those people to succeed. If you think about this idea that what's better for developers and what's better for marketers are on these two axes, what's better for users over the course of our history has always been that both intersect, that both contribute to an optimal outcome for everybody. But what we're seeing increasingly is that a better outcome for users has to rely on much more work by developers. We have to build custom interfaces to allow people to edit these things. We have to figure out ways to allow our editors to preview their content on mobile applications and on Angular applications and on and any sort of technology that you can imagine. So this idea of editing is a very crucial one. And I want to really just dig into very briefly this idea of what it means to edit everywhere or edit everything. Editing everywhere means that on any device, you can touch content, work with it, write it, and manipulate it. But one of the things that we saw, this is actually a prototype that I built about 5 years ago for the Spark distribution, illustrating what mobile editing could look like on your smartphone. But as you can see, there's not a whole lot of stuff that we can pack into that toolbar. If you've ever tried to edit a Google document, for example, on your smartphone, it's pretty frustrating. It's pretty unrealistic in terms of how you expect to be able to work with that kind of editorial experience. And one of the things that's missing from this screenshot is that that insert tab you see over there contains a toolbar for putting in a table. Now, can you imagine inserting a table and editing columns and rows and cells on your smartphone? It doesn't work out very well. It's not a very good idea. So the spectrum that we are dealing with right now is a pretty big one, which is that if we have fewer channels, we don't have to maintain so many different editorial interfaces. But the problem is that we're seeing more and more devices that may want to edit Drupal, that may want to edit that content. Is that a good idea? Perhaps not. Then there's also this idea of edit everything, which is let's take our ideas of what it means to edit content and do it universally across everything in one single interface so that we don't have to worry about editing content on an Apple Watch, for instance. Let's think about how we can edit that Apple Watch optimized content directly within our existing Drupal administrative interface. But here's the problem with that. If you think about the outside-in interfaces that Kevin O'Leary proposed about 2 years ago, one of the really interesting things is that this demonstrates how you can, as somebody who is an editor, go into an interface, a visual interface, that shows you your content in context, and you can edit that directly in that space. But the question then becomes, if I want to actually lay out my content, present content in a very different way, what does that mean? And what does it mean when I have these outside-in interfaces, but I can't actually see the layout that I'm applying to my React application, or the layout that I'm applying to my native mobile application, or the layout that I want to apply to my augmented reality overlay? These are all very important questions. And so this also doesn't work. This idea of spectrum, this spectrum of editing everything doesn't really work either, because we either have to emulate all of these technologies, we either have to emulate a mobile application or emulate an Apple Watch, or we have to tap on the shoulder of our developers and say, hey, can you help me preview this content? Can you help me look at what I'm seeing on a screen? So these two ideas are in a lot of conflict with each other. You can't edit everywhere because we can't possibly handle the massive volume of devices that we work with on a daily basis and that we experience content on a daily basis. At the same time, we have to think about infrastructurally the demands and the exigencies of what we have to do as developers to set up an environment where somebody can preview and edit content across all of these different channels. So it means that we have to think about some really hard issues. We have to think about some of these problems in a very intentional way. As the number of channels grows, Drupal is stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's a very hard situation for us to be in because we can't promise what we used to promise to our editors and to our customers. This saying here is interesting because I think it really illustrates what we have to do in terms of thinking about this from a strategic perspective. Kita kore nga putake e makakunia e kore te raka e tupo. Which means if you don't water the roots of the tree will never grow. And I want to take us all the way back to those roots and think about what this means from the context of content. Not from the context of our existing history, but from the context of what we're actually dealing with, which is fundamentally content. So I'm going to take us back to this slide and think about what do all of these things have in common. The one thing that unifies all of these different experiences is that we deliver content to them, whether it's videos or text or images. But we have new channels that are coming out every day. Every single day, we're seeing new devices come up. We're seeing new uses for content. Just actually about 6 months ago, I heard of somebody building Raspberry Pis that consume content from a Drupal REST API in order to build a business and build a startup. And we also have channels, as I mentioned, that we don't even know about yet, that we've never heard of yet, that may never even materialize within the next few months. So web is increasingly just one facet of these concerns that our editors have. And we have this very interesting tension right now between what I call channel differentiation, which means how do you drive content into these different situations, into these different settings? Because obviously, content for Amazon Echo cannot be the same as content for a website. Content for a mobile application can't be the same as the content on your Apple Watch. But then we also have to think about the fact that Drupal is meant to be this agnostic place to house all of this content. It's a single piece of content for all these channels that we're trying to get to. And that's the thing. I don't have the answers, by the way. This is something I want us to think about. But maybe what this means is that our editors have to be educated about what I call an omnichannel content strategy, which means that when you write content, you have to write content intentionally. You have to write content in a way that makes sense, regardless of where it's headed. And so this means that we have to stop thinking about content in all of these different ways, but we have to start thinking about content in the sense of how can we make our editors' lives easier. For example, that Georgia project I just showed you was very interesting because what we discovered is that the editorial team at that agency didn't have the resources to write both web content and conversational content. They could only have the resources to write one single set of content. And if you have those limitations, you can't possibly expect an organization to be able to do these things. The second crucial piece of this is that presentation becomes very hard. You have to move away from this idea that you can visually control everything, contextually, from the standpoint of in-place editing or layout, into this realm of, well, not everything can be so visually controlled. Things are limited by their context, like a Roku application, for instance. We also need to think about a single source of truth for content. This is an example from a presentation I gave at DrupalCon Vienna, which demonstrates some of the things that we have to think about with our content that's differentiated. But one thing that unifies all of these is that single content store. And if we think about all of the different types of content that we have to deal with, we have to think about where we're going to house it. It has to be in one single place. But as we've seen, this idea of being agnostic to content conflicts directly with differentiating that content across all of those channels. And this is a paradox that we have to deal with increasingly as a community. Because as we see more and more channels appear, there's more need for this kind of differentiation. Because you cannot have the kind of content you serve in a push notification with a beacon be the same as the content that you would see on a mobile application, for instance. And similarly, editing that content and having that content be different is a very, very tough thing, because you start to get into the realm of adding a whole lot of complexity to these experiences and making your marketers and editors' lives really hard. The one thing I can say is that all of this requires a single content store. But one of the questions I do want to ask all of you to think about today over the course of the sessions that are happening this weekend is, what does this mean when we're talking about unifying content into a single content store, but also having to differentiate that? And what does that look like from the user's standpoint? It's a very hard question. So what I want to do now is I want to talk briefly about conversational content. That's saying, by the way, kia hōhonu ai te punakupu, which means may the talk be good, may the talk be productive. Constructing conversational content is interesting from the standpoint of this difference that we see between web-based content and conversational content. There's a very striking difference, which is that web content is prose, it's got a lot of references, it's got a lot of links to other content, it's long form, there's a lot of verbosity. Conversational content doesn't benefit from that, because Alexa, for example, is a zero interface, which means that it has no visual component, it has no physical component. It's all oral, and it's all verbal. So information architecture in this context requires more guided flows, more unidirectional flows. And we have to answer a couple of questions. The first is, if I translate this content over to a conversational interface, does that make sense to somebody who's listening to it as opposed to reading it? What you'll find is that a lot of the content that you write for websites is not at all something that can be understood without the context of that website. Similarly, can the content be reached? Can we actually access this content without having the access to that navigational bar or all of those links on the page? Voice interface usability becomes a very big issue as well. The idea of user experience becomes a very hard question, because all of these things are so different from one another. So I want to show you very briefly something that we did with chatbots to demonstrate what these kinds of issues how we can deal with these kinds of issues and what they look like. And this is a video that Aquia Labs put together earlier this year. Have you ever had trouble crafting the perfect menu for a dinner party, or have just been too busy to put one together? Shane is swamped at work. Her Friday is packed with back-to-back meetings when she suddenly realizes that she invited her friends over for a barbecue tomorrow, and she doesn't know what food she's going to prepare. She opens the app for her favorite supermarket, Fresh Market, and taps on Chat Now with FreshBot. She's heard FreshBot makes it quicker and easier to shop for exactly what she needs, but she's never tried it. FreshBot says hi. Shayna interacts with FreshBot, which asks her questions to figure out exactly what she needs for her event, like what kind of meal it is, and how many people will be there. FreshBot uses an interaction model to know what questions to ask, like if anyone has any dietary restrictions. Thanks to FreshBot's reminder, Shayna remembers that her friend Ali recently became a vegetarian. Almost instantly, FreshBot sends her a list of recipes drawn from a database on the Fresh Market Drupal site. Some entrees, some sides, and Shayna's pretty impressed. This barbecue's gonna rock. She decides to check out the hamburger recipe to see how many steps there are to make it, so the app serves the recipe content directly from the Fresh Market Drupal site. FreshBot asks her if she wants it to put together all of the ingredients into a handy shopping list. Shayna, realizing she only has time to stop by Fresh Market tonight after work, says yes. FreshBot stores her selected recipes on the website for later. After grabbing coffee, Shayna goes back to work at her desk. Just as she's about to leave work, Shayna decides to take a look at how long that shopping list is before she heads to the store. She goes to the Fresh Market website where she's logged into her account. Shayna goes to her My Shopping List page, where she sees all the ingredients from her recipes automatically pulled into one convenient list. She's pretty happy with the length of the list, so she shuts her laptop and makes her way out the door. Off to Fresh Market. By the way, every video I'm going to show you during the course of this presentation is working Drupal code. This is all real. None of this is fake. That right there that you saw was a working chatbot with a working native mobile application with a working Drupal 8 site. So it's interesting because you never really think about that from the standpoint of a consumer, right? And when you're a consumer and you're working with these kinds of interfaces that are decontextualized, that are totally removed from your screen or your desktop, things become interesting. And this saying, for me, really represents that as well. Okay, o ringa ringa tao, which means the world is yours. The world is your oyster. What do I mean by that? Well, let's think about where we are right now in terms of where Drupal thinks about content. We have a bunch of pages in Drupal. And a lot of the CMSes that are traditional consider pages to be kind of that single unit of truth. But it's not really relevant anymore, because when you think about it, you know, much of the web still remains in this kind of page-driven fashion. But what we're seeing increasingly is that because our ideas of what content should be is driven by pages, our editorial interfaces cannot keep up with that kind of idea of what content has become today. We have to move towards a geospatial mentality. We have to move to the point where even in a store, in a brick and mortar store, for example, here in Auckland, we can go in there and see beacons transmitting, based on our location, certain information to us that's taken from Drupal. So one of the things I want to talk about is that proximity marketing is one of the things that's gaining a lot of traction right now in IoT and among analysts, which means that content has to be physical, it has to be spatial, it has to be situational, it has to be physical. It has to be something that is there, that is something that really takes into account not just where you are and the screen that you're on, but the entire world surrounding you. And this is a very important idea, because what that means is that the context that we see is all out of context. And you're gradually seeing this transition where I'm illustrating that the websites that we see content in, the context that we experience content in, is shifting entirely to move away from screens and move away from pages, to move into our rooms, this very room, for example, to the city of Auckland and the entire world. Beacons are a really big illustration of this, which is that, you know, beacons are a very prominent tool that's used right now already throughout a lot of places to allow for different experiences to be delivered to your users. One example is that Marriott has placed beacons across 14 locations to allow for promotional messages to be sent as you enter that hotel or as you move around that hotel. And increasingly, we're seeing beacons in more and more locations, including airports, including museums, including restaurants. What if you could check in automatically as you walk into a hotel and not even have to walk up to the desk? What I want to show you now is a really interesting demo that we worked on over the course of our preparation for DrupalCon Vienna, which is, imagine how beacons could improve your experience at the airport. And imagine that labyrinthine airport complex that you have to walk through. How could that change based on really well-placed beacons? What Drupal International Airport has done is they've placed beacons in certain important locations. Past the security checkpoint, at the entrance of the airport, and at the exit to arrivals. And what's happening is that our friend Ted is a passenger who is doing two things in this demo. He's going to check in, and he's going to receive a notification on his phone, and I'll illustrate that for you soon here. He's going to go to his gate, but on the way there, he gets a notification after he crosses through security. And then finally, when he disembarks, he's coming back from a trip, he's exiting into the arrivals hall, and he's going to get another notification as well. This video has no audio, so I want to narrate very quickly what's going on here. What's happening is that here we see Ted walking into the airport. He's got his suitcase, and you can see that we've got a screen capture of his phone as well. What he sees is a push notification from the airport, which basically tells him exactly what he wants to see, which is a welcome message saying, hey, come to the welcome to the airport, download this application. So he downloads the application. Now he's crossed through security, and as soon as he passes that checkpoint, he receives another notification. When he taps on that, he gets flight information about his flight, personalized exactly to his itinerary. Now he's come out of the arrivals, and he's going to get his baggage from Carousel 3. And as you can see, this is all personalized, targeted information that is directly geared towards his experience. That, by the way, was also completely real. So we have to think big. This saying, herangita mata faiti, herangita mata fanui, means he who thinks narrowly is going to be a narrow person. He who thinks wide is going to be sort of a wide-thinking person. What does that actually mean? Well, let's think about this from the standpoint of augmented reality. Augmented reality has become a much bigger trend over the course of the last few years, especially in museums, for instance. But we can deliver content to these displays too. One of the things that has happened over the course of the last 24 months is that augmented reality has gained a whole lot of prestige and a whole lot of maturity in the industry. Forrester, for example, states that within the next 3 years, we're going to see a lot more involvement of companies and of these large content enterprises actually delivering content to these kinds of experiences. But here's the thing. We also want to think about the fact that augmented reality is something that relies on you to be close to that content and relies on you being an active participant. But what if we could adjust that just a little bit and make it more passive by allowing the use of beacons plus augmented reality? It's a very interesting concept because that way we can gather some interesting insights into what the user actually is looking for. And so we're moving away from this idea of pages into this idea of experiential overlays, or things that are superimposed on top of what your real-world life looks like. And these situational changes are the links of tomorrow, are the links of Drupal's next decade. As you can see, content becomes totally decontextualized in augmented reality. Take this website, for instance, that shows you a couple of products. If I'm at the grocery store and I'm going to hold my phone up to a device, I'm going to see information that is completely taken out of context. I'm not going to see it in the same listing, the same listing page that we saw before. So here's a demo which we just recently produced, which does something very interesting. If you're at a supermarket and you want to be able to take your phone and hold it up to a product and learn more about that product, what can happen when you get this kind of interesting information? And how does that enrich your experience as a consumer? Gotta love it.
Navigating through a large or unfamiliar grocery store to find all the items on your list isn't any fun. Wouldn't it be great to have a shopping route which guides you to your items? What if you could learn more about an item simply by looking at it? Luckily, Alex uses the Freshland Market app on her smartphone. As Alex walks up to Freshland Market, the app pops up a notification. She taps it and a map of the store appears, showing where all of the items on her list are located. With the map as a guide, Alex walks over and grabs a bag of potato chips. When she looks at it with her smartphone, the app recognizes it and displays useful information, like its price and user ratings. Alex checks the potato chips off her list in the app. Next is pasta sauce. Unfortunately, she's not sure which one she wants. With the help of the user reviews and ratings the app superimposes on top of the camera view, she can make an informed decision. This one looks perfect. Last up, cereal. Alex recently chose to avoid processed sugars and already configured the app to tell her if anything contains them. The app tells her that her favorite, Cinnamon Toast Crunch, isn't a good fit. Honey Nut Cheerios also have processed sugars. Finally, Alex checks a box of Rice Krispies cereal and bingo, low processed sugars. Suddenly, Alex sees a new notification suggesting that it might be time to buy milk to go with her cereal based on her purchase history. Good catch. The app updates the shopping route and redirects her to the dairy section. Shopping finished. Time to head to the checkout line.
That also, by the way, is completely real. We filmed that in a store in Boston and really got some interesting looks from the employees as we were doing it, I can tell you. So I want to end with a little bit of a kind of meditation on these ideas. You know, we've seen that these really innovative experiences can happen through Drupal. But Drupal becomes relegated to this kind of limited role. But how can we think about the way in which Drupal can power these experiences? What are some of the ideas that we can introduce from our experience with outside-in interfaces, for example, in Drupal core? And also our ideas about what this kind of interface would look like. And I want to think about this from the standpoint of a couple of prototypes that I put together very quickly, which kind of illustrate one possible trajectory. And this is something that we could build, or something that we could explore and sprint on today, which thinks about this notion of, what if I actually do want to edit these things in a way that really makes a whole lot of sense? What would those interfaces look like? And how would they work? Because this is going to be the next great test that dictates the future of Drupal. It is something that is going to impact the way that we think about Drupal. It's going to impact everything about our preconceived notions of Drupal, our very ideas of what Drupal should be as a CMS. Here's an example. I drew this up, and I thought about what would it be like if you could create an interaction flow within the context of Drupal. And here's what this prototype actually shows you. Oh, by the way, I put in LMP, which is my favorite soda, by the way, my favorite soft drink. So if you haven't tried lemon and paeroa, I highly recommend it. It's the best. It's world famous in New Zealand. It's amazing. And you know, LMP is something that I want to be able to ask about. But I want to be able to ask my Amazon Echo or my chatbot about it as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually provide a piece of content here that is going to go into my interface. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually search all content of this type. And what you can see is that the bot is going to respond with some kind of an idea, some kind of an utterance. But fundamentally what it's going to do after it responds and gives that user feedback, it's going to search for that particular FAQ. And it's going to find, if I say, for example, where can I find LMP, it will give me that information. Next, let's think about augmented reality. So if I want to edit exactly what you saw earlier with that product information being superimposed in that overlay, what are some of the things that I might want to do? Well, first thing I might want to do is add a target image for machine vision, something that enables the system to be able to recognize what that product is. And then the next thing I might want to do, and by the way, this is all theoretical and hypothetical, but one of the things I might want to do is, well, actually I want to use a particular display mode, for example, view mode, for this kind of piece of content. But I want to just go ahead and add all the fields. And so what's going to happen is that you're going to pop up this kind of content, all these fields from this content type, on your device, right, on your smartphone in that AR overlay. I want to move around some fields, for example, so that that display changes. Finally, what about situational content? What about location-based content? If I'm going to be able to manipulate beacons, right? And by the way, beacons are in a little bit of a state of immaturity. We had a huge amount of trouble building that demo that you saw with beacons. It was really hard because beacons are still in a stage of development and still maturing as a technology. But let's take, for the sake of argument, an idea where we could actually add a location, such as a store that's located in Tauranga, and say, okay, well, I've got a beacon located there, and I want to be able to, as soon as someone enters the supermarket, to push a notification. And I want to delineate what content I want to push to that device. So I'm going to push them that promotion, the 10% off all soft drinks, which means I get 10% off my lemon and paeroa. I can bring back a case of 60 of them back to the US, which is exactly what I'm going to do after this trip, and share it with all my friends. So what I want to really get at here is that this idea of powering all of these interesting experiences, all of these crazy ideas, is something we can do together. It's something that makes us as a community and the Drupal project stronger and much more powerful and much more versatile. Because a more multifaceted Drupal is also a more future-proof Drupal. Because thanks to you, Drupal's story has only just begun. When I talk about Drupal's next decade, I'm talking about the fact that Drupal will still be around for a very long time, especially if we can get some of these ideas right, some of these issues discussed. I want to end with one last saying, which is, "Na tororo, na takuroro, kaora aiteiwi." What this means is that with your basket and with my basket, the tribe will survive. Tēnā koutou. Thank you.